A lot of times businesses will come and they'll say, okay, we know we need a podcast. Everyone tells us we need a podcast, but what are we going to talk about? We're a marketing for beauty products agency. What are we going to talk? We're talking about beauty products, 10 episodes on beauty products, and then what, right? And the first thing that we do before we buy your fancy microphones or setup, the first thing we do is just make topic maps. What are people come to you for? What are, 3-4 pillars that you can talk about? Like we would do if we were trying to figure out how to write on LinkedIn, and what, like you would do on anything, but we would come up with topic maps, figure out very clearly what you're trying to do and what you're trying to talk about. Then you can probably have 10 episodes in each one of those pillars at least, and it opens up. And that's step number one.
It is time for Build That Podcast, where we will discuss how you can use a podcast to grow your business and expand your influence. I'm your host, Eric Rutherford. Let me encourage you to sign up for the 200 words to move you forward with marketing and podcasting, delivered right to your inbox each Tuesday. Sign up for it at buildthatpodcast.com/the 200. I'll also put it in the show notes. Now, let's jump into today's episode. I'm excited today because I have with me Ahron. Ahron is a podcast producer that helps businesses strategically launch their podcasts and build stronger communities and relationships around their business. Ahron, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Eric. Happy to be here.
I'm excited. It's been neat getting to know you through LinkedIn and just having some of those comments and chats back and forth. I really value your content and your opinion and your perspective on podcasts. And I thought it would be great for the listeners to get that as well, because I think you just bring a lot of information and experience to the game. So I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, honored to connect with others in the industry and to learn from everyone.
Indeed. So before we jump in headfirst into podcasting, how did you get into podcasting? What was that background step?
So as a listener, I loved, 5 years ago, I loved listening to podcasts. I love the experience of being able to really listen and be so close to someone. You're getting the raw, unadulterated person, and you're not focused on their visual element as much. Maybe today that's changing, I'm not sure. But the audio experience of just sitting and listening and appreciating the conversation. And as a listener, I really enjoyed that. And I saw a small niche within, my life, my community. And I saw that there was a space for me to really use this power of conversation, this power of connection with other people to help spread ideas and educate people about things I thought were important. And I had started a little podcast, little at the time, with my dad, and we would sit around a table, and he's a wise man, and I would sort of feed him ideas. And it was pretty popular within our niche, within what we were doing. It was popular, and we had people sending in questions and requests. And I saw that there was something really here, and there was something really, really important. And I played around with narrative podcasts, creating stories. Those take a lot of time, a lot of energy, but really just another powerful tool, another powerful way to tell a story. A little music, a little slow, good talking, clear. And these were the things in the early days, about 5 years ago, not too early, but these were the things that sort of got me into this. And I realized that there's something really powerful about seeing and viewing yourself as an educator and viewing yourself as someone who can share, have ideas and share. Every business, and this is what brought me to the businesses, because every business is essentially, they say today, like a media company, right? That they have to look at themselves as the things they do, the clients they have, the services they provide, or the products they produce are all have media. They have content that they can generate. And I think more than just content and media, content machines or media companies, they're educators, and they can educate the world on their things. So you can take something as simple as like manufacturing and then turn that into, how are we doing sustainable manufacturing? How are we taking care of the world around us? And these are important pieces of building that brand, important pieces of who that company is, that they don't even think like that. They don't think who would want to hear us. But now podcasting allows people to listen, and therefore allows people to talk, and allows to make that connection between the company and the potential clients in a very, very deep way.
That's true. And, I think that's a great example, first from your experience with you and your dad, just having these conversations and people latching onto that, asking questions. I think especially businesses don't realize exactly what you were saying. It's this idea of, wow, you have an opportunity to educate and build this relationship with your customers. I think so often as in businesses, they're like, we just need to send out, we just need to email, we just need a website, pick your media. But it does draw people into the conversation in a very, I don't want to say tactile, but there's just something about the audio experience that really draws them in.
I think audio specifically, and this is a bit of a rant. Sorry if I'm using your podcast to rant.
Go ahead.
Should call it podcast rants. But there's a bit of like conversation about video podcasts versus audio podcasts. And I think that I tell a lot of the people, a lot of the businesses, that unless you're ready to invest lots of money on a video production, the point of a podcast is that it's real and that it's authentic. And being able to capture that authentic voice is because it's easy. And because the microphone is, set up easily on the side of your desk, and you can pull it over and press record and get something out. As soon as you start having to plan and having to drive somewhere and having to prepare or pay or whatever is necessary, so then it takes away from the authentic element of it, because by the time you sit down, you need to have good scripting, and everything needs to be more polished because there's so much more that was invested. So therefore, if companies really want to tap into it in the beginning, I say, yeah, get a USB mic, do it, plug it in, and just make it as easy as possible, because that's where you can capture the most authentic voice. So and video adds this element of investment, and then you have to look good. You got to put your, you got to wear a suit, and you got to look nice, and then you got to brush your hair. And even the video, that's, when you put up a video like this, it's not as important. It's not the main part, just to put a face to the voice.
And that's so true. It's trying to reduce the friction, just really be able to make that conversation available. And I think that's the beauty of it. Those are the ones I am most drawn to, is when they're just having that conversation, whether they are sort of a talking head kind of thing, where you have two people just talking about an industry, talking about best practices, the interview process like we're doing right now, where the host is learning from the guest, and then everybody gets to learn in the process. And I like that informality too. As you're talking, it's just a conversation. And I know when I'm listening, that's the other thing. I understand the growth of video podcasts, but I get distracted when I'm watching video podcasts. And so I'm an audio podcast guy. That resonates with me, what you're saying about the audio experience. So let's just talk about businesses in general. And so we talked about, it's an education opportunity for them. It's a way to market. It's a way to equip. So as businesses are thinking through this, it could be that they're thinking, I don't know if I want to do a podcast, or yes, I do want to do a podcast, but I have no idea how to do a podcast. As a podcast producer, how do you help businesses with that? If people are out there thinking, maybe I want to do this, but I need help, how do you help them with that?
Yeah, I love that question. And it's so important for a business. A lot of times businesses will come and they'll say, okay, we know we need a podcast. Everyone tells us we need a podcast, but what are we going to talk about? We're a marketing for beauty products agency. What are we going to talk? We're talking about beauty products, 10 episodes on beauty products, and then what, right? And the first thing that we do before we buy your fancy microphones or setup, the first thing we do is just make topic maps. What are people come to you for? What are, 3-4 pillars that you can talk about? Like we would do if we were trying to figure out how to write on LinkedIn, and what, like you would do on anything, but we would come up with topic maps. Figure out very clearly what you're trying to do and what you're trying to talk about. Then you can probably have 10 episodes in each one of those pillars at least, and it opens up. And that's step number one. So when you come to a producer, the producer is going to walk you through this step of launching your podcast. He's going to help you figure out what to talk about. He's going to figure out who to talk about with. So should you have interviews? Should you have solo episodes like yours? You have this mix. I think that's an important misnomer. It's not like one way and then you're stuck. I think it's a nice way to mix it and do special guests and different episodes and different styles, longer, shorters, test it. And that's what the producer is going to help you figure out what's right for you. The producer is going to should help you with equipment and figuring out the best budget and the best setup for your room. And the main thing is they have the finger on the industry standards, the finger on the pulse. What do people do? And I think that gets businesses scared because when businesses about content, they want to look good because it's their baby. And you can walk them through. Maybe in the first 10 episodes, okay, if you put out, Zoom recorded with no microphones audio. You're going to get past that, but you got to press record. You got to go. We got to move. And just trying to help them through that process of not being so worried about how it looks in the short term. So that's what a podcast producer does. And I really enjoy this creative process of thinking about how to position yourself. And that's where me personally, I love that part of the process. I enjoy that. I think that it's so rich what you can be educating on, how you can position yourself. I'll tell you an example of how I podcast produced myself. Sorry, I get very meta on these things. So I talk about the talking about. So I'm a podcast producer and I should have a podcast. And so instead of starting a podcast about podcasting, I started podcasting about conversations because conversations are important to me. How to have those conversations are important to me. And it's not just for the people who want to come to do a podcast. This could help people who want to learn how to have conversations on LinkedIn. How do you have what's the comment section for? Network, sitting around and having a beer. How do you have the right conversations? Meeting somebody on the street, on the bus, on the train. How do you have these kinds of conversations? What are tools and tips and tricks and things? And part of just my journey of learning how to podcast and how to be a person who connects to others. And so that's my own podcast. So it's not directly related to my business, but I think that it helps build this brand of just, being conscious of conversations and connecting.
I think that's brilliant. And I want to get to positioning because you brought that up. I think that's important. But that's the other thing I think is fascinating with podcasts is the conversations. You learn conversation skills as a host. You definitely learn conversation skills. You learn questions. But even as you're thinking through how to create a podcast, even as a team, you really have to figure out this communication thing. Otherwise, it's one directional and it just doesn't flow.
I'm trying to help people as well figure that part out, like how to have those conversations. Like, can we do a coaching call? Is it possible to teach these things in one coaching call, or are these things deeper? This is what I'm trying to figure out as I understand, and get to know more and more podcasters who are not necessarily orators nor conversationalists. And how can we give them some of those tools?
It's true because some people get it more naturally or they have experience with that. Other people, it's sort of this deer in the headlights thing of how do I even begin? And that's a tough thing. So I appreciate you thinking through how can I teach this? How can I coach this? What's that look like? Because those are real questions.
Beyond podcasting as well. These are things like when you meet somebody for the first time, do you say, long time no see? Is that the best way to get a conversation going? Like, these are just things I always think about, and maybe they can help people.
Indeed. And they do. And that's kind of backing up on your positioning point, because that's something I think is important too, because I think sometimes businesses or even content creators say, hey, this is what we do, right? So if this is my business, this is what we sell, this is the service that we offer, therefore I must talk about this. And yet that doesn't have to be the case. You could really pick a slightly different niche and sort of go a different angle or in something complementary. Would you want to elaborate on that a little bit? Because I would love to get your take on this positioning idea, because I think businesses, again, they get stuck.
Right. The problem is they get stuck. They also can't think of new topics. So they're like 10 episodes and done. They can't think of anybody who they can have on the show, because who do they have on? Clients, potential clients? They can't think creatively out of that, because they're in a very like one way of looking at how their business runs. Whereas this is fascinating to me. LinkedIn is fascinating to me in that sense. When you think of running a business through connecting with the major players in your own field, right? And that's like such a game changer to me. That's the only way LinkedIn can work, is you need to have these conversations with other people in your field. And maybe a podcast can run that same way. So if you have an e-commerce business, maybe you should be speaking to your competitors who sell the same thing, maybe variations, but by building that trust with your audience, the audience now says, this guy is so confident in what he does that he can speak to other, people. So now I trust that business. I trust that podcast, because they're so confident and they know what they're doing. They're not afraid. And so that's just another way of this positioning that you can get out of your own head. You can now expand the topics and the guests you can have on.
And that's a mindset thing. I think of it as that scarcity versus abundance mindset. That is a mindset shift, though, for a lot of businesses, as opposed to I have to keep my competitors at arm's length. It's suddenly there's enough marketplace where we can have a conversation and be complementary to one another in the audience and in the marketplace. So as with businesses, as they're looking ahead, do you think a podcast is right for all businesses? How do they know if it's right? And just what are some questions they need to ask before jumping in?
I think you really need to think of that. Those are a few questions, but my overarching answer there for that is that you need to have the conversation with yourself of sustainability. How can I keep this going for a long time? Like, I'm thinking a year, 2 years down the road. Am I able to do that? Am I able to keep this thing alive? And that's a big conversation you have to have with yourself or with your, employees or employers, that you really got to think about that. And are we committed to this enough to keep it going? Because I wrote about this a little bit and it's not so clear, but I think that's what we're looking at now. Everybody was starting a podcast in 2020, and it's important, and it was easy. It is easy. It still stays easy to keep it, but you have to be creative and you have to think, how am I going to keep this thing going? And how, like, down the road, we're not just talking about 10 and then leave it, unless you're doing series. But if you're trying to create a podcast in the regular, normal sense, then it's about showing up each week. And can you do that? A lot of times, and I wonder what you think about this, but like a company will come and it's very close to their heart because it's so important to them and to get this message out, and they're sold on the idea of a podcast, but then they want their CEO to be the one who runs the podcast each week, which is great because he's got the best ideas. But is that sustainable? We got to move mountains every time we want to press record in order to get the guy and this and get the person who wrote the script. And maybe we should put it a little bit lower down in the organization and let somebody who has the time to be able to commit to that, to do 50 episodes. Just another tip for anybody who's starting within their organization. This is just a creative way of doing it, is shifting hosts. So you have 3 people in the organization who are good at it. None of them really want to take it over. So say you do 4 episodes, you do 4 episodes. They'll all be more specific to your job titles. So we'll try to create series like that. That might be a way that you can get a lot more episodes out and not be on one person's plate. It's just thinking, yeah.
It's sort of like there's no one way we have to do this. You can look at the team approach. I like that idea with multiple hosts because it really breaks up the workload. And I think it's important what you were talking about earlier is a lot of times I hear we want the most senior person in the company, or we want the head of the department or the head of whatever. And their time is really limited. And so for my experience is, for a podcast to succeed, you really need to keep the friction as low as possible. So that's something else to think through. And then that becomes a question of, okay, are they willing to delegate that responsibility to somebody else? Is there someone else who can speak to it? Those are all good questions that companies need to think through, and they're going to run into the problems if they don't. What have you seen limit the success of podcasts for businesses? Is there like one thing they do wrong? Is it like a series of things? Does it just go wrong all of a sudden? What's that look like?
It's a great way of thinking of like, why wouldn't this work in the long run? And I think that there's two things. There's a mindset and then there's technical things. The mindset is, sort of the cash grab. This is going to bring me leads right away, or I'm going to be able to get sponsorships right away. I believe that when you're dealing with these small niche podcasts, it's not really part of the conversation in the beginning while you're launching until you really have your groove and you really know what you're doing. The conversation of advertising, if it's on a CPM models, like what are you making? You're making maybe a couple dollars. I doubt you'd even have 1,000 listens. So I don't even know. Maybe you can get somebody who can pay you, but you're not making a lot of money. So it's really not going to bring in a lot of money to you. And switching that mindset, instead of this thing's going to get me leads or get me money in the first 10 episodes, it's really about how is this going to create the relationships, the network, the community around my business now that I have something to rely on when I'm launching new products or when I'm doing some kind of fundraising, whatever your company is. And that's something I think limits when you think of it as making money. A funny story is that I had a podcast for a very specific need. They had maybe 30 listens each week, but it was working for them. They were, creating good content. People were engaged. It was working. And they came to me after like 30 episodes and they said, okay, I think we're ready to monetize. And I said, that's great, but either we're going to have to work really, really hard on finding someone who values 30 listeners and we can prove the engagement, which is possible, but that's one way. Or we're going to just, throw on some random ads and take up ad space, and it's going to be random for the listener. It's not going to be enjoyable for them to listen to, and we're going to lose any of those 30. So that, I think, is the mindset that you have to have going in, that this thing's not advertising and it's not really going to bring you in leads so clearly right away.
One of the things with podcasting, it's very much a long game. Like you say, it's building community, which feels weird to a lot of businesses because they think of everything very transactionally, but really it is a community building and you're building that familiarity. And, I like to think of it as these are sales calls you don't have to have, or that can happen even while you're asleep. Right? Instead of building that relationship with a salesperson, picking up the phone or going on site or doing any of those things, these are ways for people to learn about you and your company while you're doing other stuff.
Love that.
But the monetizing thing too is important because I think businesses, it's hard to make money strictly with a podcast if that's the whole goal. But with that community, you can develop that relationship. So when people are ready to buy, they reach out to you. So how can businesses think through podcasts to generate leads? Is it really the community building aspect that you think is the best way to do it? Or are there other ways within that, knowing that it's just going to take a long time? This is a secondary but really valuable means of building.
So I'll give you a story as well here, that I had a podcast. They were a tech startup creating a sales product. Okay. And they were trying to launch this product, but we're having a really hard time talking to sales leaders to pitch them their product, to even just try a free version of the product, because sales leaders are busy. They don't want to hear this. And so we thought of this idea that let's have, and now this was a year and a half ago, which at the time was very different, but now it's being used a lot. And I think it's very effective. What we did was, let's create a podcast and have on salespeople and the sales representatives that we would want to give them this product, but they don't have the time for us. Let's have them on the podcast. And that's, essentially our client, or the client for the business is going to be the guest on the podcast. And they have 45 minutes of a talk about, it was a virtual sales product, okay, to help. So the conversations were all about what's the problems with virtual sales today? Is Zoom the best product? And then at the end, it was, by the way, if you ever want, we are creating a product that will help with the virtual sales. Oh, really? Okay. Can we book another call? Yeah, sure. Here's my, on the podcast, almost right at the end, I had to edit this one out every time that they were like, well, can we sign, like, let's get a demo. Because once you've created that conversation, again, creatively positioning yourself, but it's not your traditional way of getting leads, but you can come up with a way. Now that's heavy leads, because there we did about 100 episodes, which was 100 conversations. They did it both in French and in English. And so they had 50 of each, and it worked for them. And then unfortunately, they just didn't see the need for it anymore. So they stopped the podcast. So they didn't have the longest, but that was like the quickest I've ever seen it work, was that. And that's why when it was finished, But you can come up with ideas like that. That's one issue. And then the second is just content. By creating content and using this as your big rock, as they call it, right, of content, that then you create clips and blog posts, and you can take all of this content out of your podcast and repurpose it 7, 8, I don't know, people can creative to 10, 12 times that you can get out of a podcast. And that's a way of generating more leads using then, LinkedIn or other socials to be able to attract leads.
I'm a huge fan of repurposing content. I see so much value in that. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something else that businesses can do that really saves on cost, because once you have the content, you can use it a lot of different ways, whether that's, like you say, blogs, other video snippets, audio snippets, transcripts. Transcripts are something I've really learned about in the last 6 months and come to really appreciate the power of those. Do you think, like, as businesses consider podcasting, is a transcript one of the things you would recommend that they add to what they do?
Yeah. Can I turn this one on you? Like, I would love to know if you could explore that a little bit. Like, how are you using transcripts? Because I came here to learn just as much as you did.
It's a funny question, because actually I had this really cool conversation with a podcast guest yesterday that's going to air here in a couple of weeks, talking about transcripts and a product they're putting together. Whether it's SEO value on your website, because podcasts are just not that searchable, and podcast search engines are not great, but like Google and YouTube and some of these others, they can find your website pretty well. And so that's one way, it's to make them searchable. I like being able to keyword search. Sometimes that was something that the guest I had yesterday brought up, was this idea of, so he's French, and so he's a non-native English speaker. It was funny, as we were just having this conversation, he said, I read and write English really well, but my verbal, being able to speak it and listen is much slower. So for him, being able to have a written transcript, he can just run through it so much easier than if he were trying to sit down and listen, and it's much slower. Those are just a couple of things that I've learned to appreciate, especially as you can point people to a website and put your transcript there, and it really can be something that sets it apart. Although I still put them in the episode within the podcast hosting service as well, just to help. So this is something new. I've been doing it a lot since December, so I'm experimenting, but I'm big on transcripts. But like you said, the blog functionality, you can just take it, repurpose it, write a blog, write an article, write multiple articles, lots of opportunities there.
Yeah, I like that. That's a cool thought, like a cool way of using it to read it. And I've seen people talk about this, where just reading the transcripts are better than, because sometimes you don't have the time. But I believe that was you were talking about that, right? Not having the time to read it and being able to do that. And I want to add, for anybody who's thinking of making a podcast or thinking about then using this, like, oh, okay, transcripts, then I have to sit there and type it out or hire somebody. These things could cost me. Not anymore. This stuff, there's a great tool. I'm a big fan of Descript. I think that for the simple, try to get a lot of content out of your podcast. It's a great tool. It's not a professional tool, but it is a great tool to be able to use, get a transcript. You got to fix it up a little bit. It's probably, maybe you could disagree with me. I think it's about 75% accurate.
I go with that, 75, 80. It does good, but it definitely doesn't make it perfect.
So you got to go over it. But once you do that, then you have a nice transcript, and then you can use that for all your different things. So there's not a lot of friction there to get this stuff out, to create it. Descript will also help you create clips. It'll also just easy stuff. Once your podcast is totally out, it's up. We're talking about podcasts from, even repurposing stuff from months ago. So Descript is a great tool for that.
I agree. I use it. And like you say, once you have the recording, you can go back, you can go backwards in your catalog, you can pull anything, you can go and add transcripts. And I love that tool. I will put a link to it in the show notes because it takes so much work out instead of having to try and write something on your own. I'm glad you brought that one up. As we're kind of wrapping up here, any takeaways you want to leave with the audience in terms of anything related to podcasting?
Yeah, I think podcasting is not set and forget. And you don't just do it, and you got to be creative. You got to constantly be thinking. I think that you should return back to your episodes after about every 10 episodes and look back, take your pulse. How's it going? Relationships, right people. Did I have the right people on the podcast? Am I doing the right guest outreach? Am I recording the right way? Is my intro and outro good? Just take your pulse. Don't just stay with it the whole way through, even if you're in it for the long run, like you can constantly be changing it. And it's a really fun thing to, when you follow a podcast for a year or two and you see that they're changing and they're trying different things. It's not annoying if it's being done with you in mind, with the listener in mind. And I think that's an important takeaway. And have fun. It's a really enjoyable space and place to be in. It's not so scary. It's not so hard. It's a fun, enjoyable place to have conversations and to educate.
I love that. That is true. It's keep reevaluating, have some fun with it, build some relationships. If listeners want to know more about you, if they're like, hey, Ahron sounds like a guy I want to have a conversation with for a potential podcast, where would you like them to go?
LinkedIn. I am all in, and I will respond quicker there than sometimes to my wife and kids. And reach me, find me on LinkedIn. I know my last name is a mouthful, but you'll find it in the show notes. You can just click it and you could just take it and find me on LinkedIn. And I talk about, this is what I talk about. I talk about how to create podcasts that are going to last. How do we strategically place ourselves within our industry? And how do we have better conversations to better educate? These are all the things I talk about.
Definitely. So I'm going to put Ahron's contact, as he said, all of that's going to be in the show notes. Check him out on LinkedIn, follow him. He really does have some excellent content. You're going to learn a ton from him and what he is putting out there. So Ahron, this has been a delight today. I really appreciate you joining me.
I am so lucky to be here, and I'm so lucky to, together with you, help shape this industry. I think that that's what we're doing, and we're helping guide it along and help see that it blossoms into something that's really, really beautiful.
Make sure to sign up for the 200 at buildthatpodcast.com/the 200 and receive 200 words every Tuesday to move you forward with marketing and podcasting, delivered right to your inbox. Lastly, if you have questions or comments, you can find me on LinkedIn at Eric Rutherford, DM me on Twitter at rfordej, or email me at eric@straightforwardmg.com. Remember, use podcasts to grow your business and expand your influence.